In this short video, I want to outline my vision with the Latinum Project. This is a concept map I made for myself some years ago when I was thinking my way through the material that was necessary. It all started off when I discovered or rediscovered Adler's practical grammar of the Latin language. Very shortly, a couple of days after Google first scanned it, I was looking for a particular way into Latin. I was looking for a comprehensive textbook aimed at speaking Latin. I thought such a book must have been written, and I came across George Adler's A Practical Grammar of the Latin Language. Google's initial scan was very poor. Every 8th page was illegible, and so I tried to get hold of a hard copy. I contacted the British Library and discovered there was one copy of Adler's text in the United Kingdom, and in American collections, only 8 of his books, 8 examples of the original, have survived, one of which Google scanned. Adler's book had completely fallen off the radar. Nobody knew about it. I wrote to various universities, various Latin professionals, asking people about this book. Who was George Adler? I discovered that George Adler was a genius. He had written a German dictionary, which had made him go mad, basically. He spent his time, after he was fired from his tenure at the University of New York, writing a practical grammar of the Latin language. This was published a year after his death, and at his funeral, nobody attended except for the author Herman Melville, who was a very close friend, and the director of the institution, the Bloomsbury Lunatic Asylum, Adler, and I think one other person at this great man's funeral. He was a recluse, he was obsessive, and he spent his entire time, the last 10 years of his life, writing this book. So it's very long, and it's the most comprehensive Latin textbook, I would say, ever written for a beginner. What I've done is I've turned it into an immersion audio course, and the book itself is now available as a reprint online, very easy to find, and the course and the book have become quite popular in the community of those who are trying to reach a degree of fluency in their Latin. So in the textbook, part A is a recording of the grammar, and the grammar sections explained. In my oral representation, I do rephrase Adler's language, which is 19th century, and of course Adler was a German first language speaker, and he learned English later on, so sometimes his English is a little bit stilted. Part B of each recorded lesson is the dialogue syntax, alternating in Latin, back to English, back to Latin, for each phrase introduced by Adler. And then part C is a re-recording of these question-answer sequences in 2 readings. The first is slow with lots of time, and the second is at a brisker pace. So that is the foundation, I suppose, of the Latinum course, the Adler material. A second plank is the Comenius Project. John Amos Comenius was a very important man in the history of education and in the history of Latin education. And he put together an entire curriculum of textbooks which aimed to bring you up to a very high level, starting with the Vestibulum, then the Orbis Sensualium Pictus, and the Janua Linguarum. The Vestibulum and the Orbis Sensualium Pictus are available at latinum.org for the princely sum of $1.99 for the download. They are very useful texts. If you're just beginning your Latin studies, then the Vestibulum is for you. And even if you are more advanced, you will find, to your surprise, that much of the vocabulary in the Vestibulum and the Orbis Pictus will be unknown to you. Comenius also put together student dictionaries, only in Latin. There were Latin dictionaries. And finally, as a component of this, an offshoot for Comenius, is Pexenfelder's Apparatus Eruditionis, and also Comenius's grammatical material, which will be produced. Some of it is available already. The method of the Latinum course, the goal is fluency, so that you can read text without having to translate. The goal is not to have a running commentary in your home language in your head, but to read Latin as Latin. More time spent in Latin without an intermediary language, and the goal is also to use all channels, speaking, listening, and the productive channels, that is, writing. The Latin course, the Latinum course, is produced, of course, by myself, Evan der Milner, that is Molendinarius in Latin. What else is available? There are various stories, that's readers in various ability levels. These are available at latinum.org.uk, where everything is categorized by ability level. We have pronunciation, where you can... I've been quite careful to make sure that the quantities, the vowel quantities, are correct in anything that I read out loud, and I use the restored classical pronunciation. The second plank of this entire project was Scholar. Before Scholar existed, there was one website that had a Latin-only rule, and it had 8 members. And even the website itself wasn't in Latin. I thought, well, there must be a way around this. And there's a little book called the Green Book of Language Revival. And I read through that, and I was inspired by the example of the Hawaiian language, where to help rejuvenate the language, a Hawaiian bulletin board was put together, and the rules there were only Hawaiian could be used. And the entire bulletin board was constructed in Hawaiian. So it was like a Facebook for Hawaiian before Facebook existed. A social network. I thought, well, why not do this for Latin? And so I looked around to find a social network that would enable me to translate the entire language file for the network. And Ning had such a network. When I started it, Ning was free. We now pay an annual rent for the site, which the members of Scholar, of which there are now over 2,000, raise. So Scholar is very international. It uses language. People use Latin to communicate with each other. There's a little chat room on Scholar which is active most nights. And there's a rule on Scholar: you can only use Latin. The only exception where you can use another language is if you're asking what a word means, in which case you can include it in a quote where most of what you're writing is in Latin. One thing to keep in mind: there are very, very few people on earth who can write in Latin at all, let alone write it well. The goal of Scholar is to give people the courage to start to write in Latin in an environment where no one's going to jump down your throat if you make a mistake, where the environment is one that is open, not censorious, and one where people are engaged in primarily communication. So we have a rule: no correcting users Latin is allowed unless that person gives permission. Scholar, as I said, was founded by myself, and the initial translation was done by myself and John Doublier. We spent many, many hours bouncing emails backwards and forwards. Unfortunately, John has suffered a stroke and can no longer contribute to the Latinum Project. Resources on Scholar: there's a video library, there's the locutorium where you can speak face-to-face, the scriptorium where most of the activity tends to take place, where you type to each other, and then there's the photo lexicon, which contains 3,800 labeled photographs, and this is available for download in one go for the princely sum of $1.99 at latinum.org.uk. So that is the Latinum Project as it stands at the moment. And of course, a large part of this project, which is not on this, but is now a very, very substantial section, is this. Audiovisual, and this is Evan1965 YouTube, because this did not exist when I first started the Latinum Project, and on YouTube there are now over 600 videos, and this is one of them. Vale, goodbye.